The goblet slipped from Elira's hand and shattered against the stone floor, and the entire hall turned to look at her. Laughter came fast, sharp and cruel, rolling from the long tables where the Blackthorn pack sat feasting. Someone shouted that the scarred girl could not even hold a cup without dropping it, and another voice added that her hands probably could not feel the metal at all, not with skin like hers. Elira dropped to her knees to gather the broken glass, her face burning hotter than the marks that covered her arms, and she said nothing, because saying anything only made it worse. She had learned that lesson years ago. The burns ran from her wrist to her collarbone, pale and ridged, a map of the night her family's home had gone up in flames when she was 9 years old. She had survived. Her parents had not. The pack had taken her in only because leaving a child to die in the woods reflected poorly on their honor, and from that day on she had scrubbed their floors, hauled their firewood, and carried their water, always at the edges of every room, always the last one noticed and the first one blamed. Werewolves lived and loved by scent. A person's true scent carried the promise of who they might belong to, who might recognize them across a crowded hall as a mate meant only for them. Fire had a way of ruining that. The healer said her burns had damaged whatever scent she once carried, leaving it faint and broken, impossible to read. The pack had a simpler way of putting it. They called her scentless. Ruined. Unwanted. She swept the last of the glass into her apron and rose to her feet, and Alpha Edmund Cole did not even glance her way as he waved a hand for her to leave his sight. "Get back to the kitchens," he said, already returning to his wine. "We have a king to prepare for." The words rippled through the hall with new energy, chasing away the laughter at her expense and replacing it with something closer to excitement. The Alpha King of the Frostmane pack was coming, and every wolf in Blackthorn wanted to be seen, wanted to be remembered, wanted a chance at the kind of alliance that could change their standing forever. Elira slipped through the side door into the corridor, her arm still stinging from where the hot goblet had splashed against her wrist. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over things like this a long time ago. Instead she walked, quiet and quick, toward the kitchens, where at least the fire in the hearth did not laugh at her. Nora was already there, elbow deep in flour, and she looked up the moment Elira came through the door. "They made you serve again," Nora said. It was not a question. "Someone had to fill the cups," Elira answered, reaching for a rag to wipe the last of the wine from her sleeve. "I do not mind." "You always say that." Nora shook her head, dusting flour from her hands. "One day you should mind." Elira did not answer. Minding had never done her any good before, and she doubted it would start now. She busied herself instead with the pile of dishes stacked near the wash basin, letting the familiar motion of scrubbing settle the ache in her chest. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread and roasted meat, and for a while she could almost forget the hall full of wolves who thought her scent, and by extension her very existence, was some kind of joke. Word of the Alpha King's visit had been spreading through the castle for days. Kalen Voss ruled the Frostmane pack, one of the largest and most respected packs in the north, and his territory bordered Blackthorn's uncontested lands. A treaty between the two packs would secure peace for a generation, and Alpha Edmund had spared no expense preparing for the visit. New tapestries had been hung in the Great Hall. The finest wine had been brought up from the cellars. Every wolf who could claim even a distant connection to nobility had been polishing themselves for days, hoping to catch the eye of a king known for his strength and his fairness. Elira had heard whispers about him too, carried through the kitchen gossip that traveled faster than any official news. They said he was young for an Alpha King, having taken his throne after his father's sudden passing, and that he had spent the years since proving himself worthy of it through both battle and diplomacy. They said his temper was legendary when provoked, but that he was patient with his own people almost to a fault. They said he had never taken a mate, despite pressure from his advisors, because he refused to settle for anything less than the bond every wolf dreamed of finding. None of it mattered to Elira. Kings did not concern themselves with kitchen maids, and she had no reason to expect that this one would be any different. "You should stay down here tomorrow night," Nora said later, as they laid out trays for the following day's feast. "During the treaty dinner, Alpha Edmund will not want you anywhere near the high table." "I know." Elira set a stack of clean plates onto the counter. "He already told me as much." "Good." Then stay in the kitchen where it's safe. Elira almost laughed at that. Safe was a strange word to use for a place where she spent her days breathing in smoke and steam, scrubbing pots until her fingers ached, always aware that one wrong word from anyone above her station could see her thrown out into the cold with nothing. But she understood what Nora meant. Safe from the mockery. Safe from being paraded in front of a king only to be laughed at in front of him too. That night, after the kitchen had gone quiet and the last of the dishes had been put away, Elira allowed herself a few private minutes near the small window above the wash basin. The moon hung low and full over the castle grounds, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the call of wolves running free in the surrounding forest, unbothered by titles or treaties or the shape of anyone's scars. She rolled up her sleeve and looked at the bands along her forearm, silver and pink in the moonlight. She used to hide them beneath long sleeves whenever she could, but the kitchen fires made that impractical, and eventually she had stopped trying. There was no point hiding what everyone already knew about her. A broken scent. A ruined mate bond. A girl no wolf would ever want to claim. She had made peace with that fact years ago, or told herself she had. It still stung sometimes, late at night, when the castle was quiet and she let herself imagine what it might feel like to be looked at the way other girls were looked at, to be seen as something more than a burden the pack had reluctantly taken in. But wishing never changed anything. She pulled her sleeve back down, banged the kitchen fire for the night, and went to the small room she shared with two other maids, where she slept fitfully, dreaming of nothing in particular. The next day arrived with an energy she had never felt in the castle before. Servants rushed through every hallway carrying flowers, polished silver, and bolts of fine fabric. The younger unmated wolves of the pack primed and preened, practicing their most charming smiles in any reflective surface they could find, certain that a king in need of a mate might notice one of them among the crowd. Even Alpha Edmund's own daughter, Beatrice, spent the better part of the morning being fitted into a gown so fine it took 3 maids to lace it properly. Elira spent the day exactly where she was expected to be. In the kitchens, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, sweating over ovens that ran hot enough to make her scars ache in a way she had grown used to ignoring. Occasionally she caught snippets of conversation drifting down from the halls above, excited voices speculating about what the Alpha King might look like, whether he would be as fearsome as the stories claimed, whether Beatrice truly had a chance at catching his eye. They say his pack is the strongest in the north, one of the younger maids said, arranging pastries onto a silver tray. Stronger even than ours. They say he single-handedly drove back an invading pack from the eastern border 3 winters ago, another added, her eyes wide with admiration. Without losing a single wolf. Elira kept her head down and continued her work. None of it was her concern. Kings and treaties and territory disputes existed in a world entirely separate from her own, a world of polished floors and grand titles that she only ever glimpsed from behind a serving tray or beneath a mop. By evening, the great hall had been transformed. Candles lined every table, their light catching on polished silver and crystal glassware. The finest tapestries the pack owned hung along the walls, and the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine filled the air. Every wolf who mattered in Blackthorn's hierarchy had gathered, dressed in their finest clothing, waiting with barely contained excitement for the arrival of their guest. Elira was meant to stay in the kitchen. That had been made abundantly clear. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One of the senior serving girls, a woman named Clara who usually handled the high table, twisted her ankle badly on the kitchen steps only an hour before the feast was set to begin. She cried out in pain, and within moments the kitchen was in chaos, cooks shouting orders, other maids scrambling to finish preparations that Clara had been meant to oversee. Someone needs to serve the head table, the head cook said, panic evident in her voice. We cannot let Alpha Edmund see an empty station when the king arrives. Every eye in the kitchen turned toward Elira. Not her, someone objected immediately. Alpha Edmund said. Alpha Edmund is not here to say anything right now, and we have no other choice, the head cook snapped. Elira, you know the routine well enough. Go. Now. And for heaven's sake, be careful. There was no time to argue, and truthfully, no one else available to take Clara's place. Elira set down the knife she had been using, smoothed her apron as best she could, and made her way toward the great hall with her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. She had served at smaller gatherings before, always at the edges, always for lesser guests. Never at the head table, and certainly never for a visiting king. But there was no time to think about that now. She slipped through the side entrance just as the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and a hush fell over the entire room. The Alpha King had arrived. Kellen Voss walked into the hall flanked by two of his most trusted guards, Victor and Garrett, both broad-shouldered men who scanned the room out of habit even in a space clearly meant for celebration. Kellen himself moved differently than most alphas Elira had ever seen, without the swagger or the performance she had come to expect from powerful men. He simply walked, calm and measured, his dark eyes taking in the hall with a quiet assessment that missed nothing. Alpha Edmund rose immediately to greet him, all warmth and practiced charm, gesturing toward the head table where the finest chairs had been arranged. Beatrice curtsied so deeply that Elira, watching from the shadows near the wall, wondered how the girl managed to keep her balance in that heavy gown. "Your Majesty," Alpha Edmund said, bowing his head slightly. "Welcome to Blackthorn. We are honored by your presence." "The honor is mine," Kellen replied, his voice low and even. "I have heard much about your pack's hospitality." Introductions continued for several minutes, names and titles exchanged with the kind of practiced formality Elira had witnessed countless times from behind serving trays. She kept to her position near the wall, waiting for her moment to step forward and begin filling cups, wishing desperately that Clara had not twisted her ankle at the worst possible time. When the guests finally settled into their seats, Elira moved forward with the pitcher of wine, keeping her eyes carefully lowered as she had been trained to do. She filled Alpha Edmund's cup first, then Beatrice's, working her way down the table with practiced efficiency, hoping to remain as invisible as possible. She reached the Alpha King's seat last. Kellen had been speaking with Victor about something related to the border patrols, his attention focused entirely on the conversation, and Elira leaned forward carefully to fill his cup without interrupting. She was close enough now to catch the scent of him, wood smoke and pine and something colder underneath, like fresh snow settling over open ground. And then he stopped speaking mid-sentence. His entire body went still, the way a wolf goes still when it catches a scent on the wind that changes everything. Elira froze too, uncertain what she had done wrong, her hand still gripping the pitcher as wine continued to pour a fraction too long into his cup before she caught herself and pulled back. Kellen turned his head slowly and looked directly at her. It was not the look she was used to receiving from wolves of his standing. There was no disdain in it, no dismissal, no flicker of disgust at the sight of her scarred arms visible beneath her rolled sleeves. Instead, his dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her stomach twist into knots, as though he were trying to solve some puzzle only he could see. "What is your name?" he asked. The entire table fell silent. Elira felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward her, and her cheeks burned with sudden heat. "Elira, my lord," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elira Hatfield." Something shifted behind his eyes at the sound of her name, though she could not begin to guess what it meant. He opened his mouth as though to say something further, but Alpha Edmund's voice cut smoothly across the moment. "My apologies, Your Majesty. That girl works in our kitchens and should not have been serving at this table tonight. One of our regular staff suffered an injury just before your arrival." Edmund waved a dismissive hand in Elira's direction. "You may return to your duties." Elira did not need to be told twice. She stepped back from the table, gripping the pitcher tightly to keep her hands from shaking, and retreated toward the kitchen doorway as quickly as decorum allowed. But she felt his eyes on her the entire way. Behind her, the conversation at the high table resumed, though Kellen seemed distracted for the remainder of the meal, answering questions from Alpha Edmund with polite but noticeably shorter responses than before. Beatrice attempted several times to draw his attention with stories of her own accomplishments, her laughter a touch too bright, her compliments a touch too eager, but the king's focus kept drifting, his gaze occasionally flicking toward the kitchen doorway as though searching for something. In the kitchen, Elira set down the pitcher with hands that trembled slightly, unsure why her heart continued to pound long after the moment had passed. "What happened out there?" Nora asked, noticing immediately that something was different. "You look pale." "Nothing happened," Elira said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "The Alpha King asked my name, that's all." Alpha Edmund sent me back before anything else. Nora's eyebrows rose with interest. The king asked your name. Why would he do that? I don't know. Elira busied herself with cleaning a stack of dishes that did not particularly need cleaning, if only to give her hands something to do besides shake. Probably curious why a kitchen maid was serving the head table. Nothing more than that. But something in her chest disagreed with that explanation, some quiet instinct she could not name that whispered there had been more to that moment than simple curiosity. Back in the great hall, the feast continued, though Caleb found himself unable to fully engage with it. Beatrice's conversation washed over him without truly landing, her perfume too heavy, her laugh too calculated, and every instinct in his body kept circling back to the moment his senses had caught that scent beneath the wine and the smoke and the crowded room. It had been faint. Almost imperceptible, layered beneath years of scar tissue and hard labor, but unmistakable once it registered. Every wolf carried a scent unique to them, and beneath every scent lay the deeper signature that marked a person as a potential mate to someone specific in all the world. Kalen had caught traces of countless scents over the years, at gatherings, negotiations, and diplomatic visits across every territory he had ever set foot in. None of them had ever affected him the way this one had. He had felt it settle into his chest like a hook catching hold of something essential, a recognition so sudden and so complete that for a moment he had forgotten how to breathe properly. It defied everything the healers claimed about scarred scent being broken or unreadable. Whatever damage the fire had done to her outward signature, it had not touched whatever lay beneath it, the true mark that only a true mate could ever detect. He needed to know if he was right. He needed to see her again, to be certain his instincts had not deceived him in the noise and confusion of the crowded hall. Your Majesty, Beatrice was saying, her hand resting a fraction too close to his own on the table, perhaps you would enjoy a walk through our gardens after the meal. They are quite beautiful this time of year. Perhaps another time, Kalen replied, his tone polite but distant. I find myself unexpectedly tired this evening. Disappointment flickered across Beatrice's face before she masked it with a practiced smile, but Kalen barely noticed. His mind remained fixed on the kitchen doorway and the girl who had disappeared through it, her scarred arms and quiet voice lodged firmly in his thoughts. The feast dragged on for what felt like hours, filled with toasts to the future alliance, discussions of border territories, and careful diplomatic maneuvering between Alpha Edmund and his king. Kalen participated where necessary, offering measured responses and diplomatic assurances, but every part of him strained toward patience he did not naturally possess. Finally, as the evening wound down and guests began excusing themselves for the night, Kalen rose from his seat and offered his own polite farewells, thanking Alpha Edmund for his hospitality and promising to continue their discussions the following day. Allow me to show you to your quarters personally, Your Majesty, Edmund offered, clearly eager to continue currying favor. That won't be necessary, Kalen said. I would like a moment to walk alone and clear my head after such a rich meal. Your castle is beautiful. I would enjoy exploring a little before retiring. Edmund, though visibly surprised, did not argue with the king's request. Of course, Your Majesty. Please, feel free to wander wherever you wish. My home is yours tonight. Kalen thanked him and made his way from the hall, his guards falling into step a respectful distance behind him. Once they were out of sight of the main gathering, he turned to Victor and Garrett with quiet instructions. Give me some time alone, he said. I need to think. Victor exchanged a glance with Garrett but nodded without question, both men peeling away to wait near the entrance while Kalen continued deeper into the castle, following a path that instinct alone seemed to guide him toward. He did not consciously decide to walk toward the kitchens. His feet simply carried him there, drawn by a scent he could still faintly detect even through stone walls and closed doors, a thread he could not ignore no matter how hard reason argued that a king had no business wandering into the servants' quarters in the middle of the night. He found himself standing outside the kitchen door sooner than he expected, his heart beating with an urgency that felt entirely foreign to a man who had spent years cultivating calm control over every situation he encountered. Inside, through a narrow gap in the door, he could see her. Elira stood alone near a dying fire, her sleeves rolled up as she scrubbed the last of the evening's dishes, unaware that she was being watched. The firelight caught the scars along her arms, illuminating the pattern of old wounds that had clearly shaped so much of her life, and Kellen felt something in his chest tighten at the sight. She looked exhausted. Not merely tired from a long day of work, but weary in a deeper way, the kind of exhaustion that came from years of being overlooked and underestimated. And yet there was something quietly dignified in the way she moved, methodical and unhurried despite the late hour, as though she had long ago made peace with a life that demanded everything from her and offered little in return. Kellen pushed open the door. Elira startled at the sound, nearly dropping the plate in her hands as she turned to find the Alpha King standing in the kitchen doorway, looking entirely out of place among the pots and drying herbs and dim firelight. "Your Majesty," she said quickly, setting down the plate and dropping into a hasty curtsy, her cheeks flushing with alarm. "I did not expect, forgive me, is something wrong? Do you require something?" Kellen stepped further into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. "I needed to see you again," he said simply. "I apologize for the intrusion at this hour, but I could not leave without understanding something first." Elira straightened slowly, confusion evident on her face. "Understanding what, my lord?" He studied her for a long moment, close enough now that there was no mistaking the scent that had struck him so forcefully at the feast. It wrapped around him with quiet certainty, confirming everything his instincts had already told him hours before. "Your scent," he said quietly. "May I ask you something honestly, without fear of offense?" Elira's hands twisted nervously in her apron. "Of course, Your Majesty." "Do people often tell you that your scent is broken? That the fire took something from you that cannot be recovered?" The question hit harder than she expected, old wounds reopening at the mere mention of something she had spent years trying not to think about. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Often." Kellen shook his head slowly. "They are wrong?" Elira blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "My lord." "They are wrong," he repeated, taking a careful step closer, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished. She did not. "Your scent is not broken, Elira. It is layered beneath scars that would make it difficult for most wolves to detect clearly, yes. But it is not gone. And it is not ruined." "I don't understand," she whispered, though something in her chest had already begun to race ahead of her thoughts, refusing to let her dismiss his words as easily as she wanted to. Kellen held her gaze steadily, his voice quiet but certain in the dim firelight of the empty kitchen. "I recognized it the moment you filled my cup tonight," he said. "I have never in my life felt anything like it before. Elira, I believe you are my mate." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a weight that Elira could not begin to process. Surely this was some cruel trick, some elaborate joke orchestrated by someone in the pack who wanted to humiliate her further, though she could not imagine why a king would lower himself to such a scheme. "That is not possible," she said, taking a shaky step backward. "You must be mistaken. Everyone knows my scent cannot be read properly. It has been this way since the fire. There must be some misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Kellen said gently, though he did not move closer, giving her the space she clearly needed. "A maid bond does not lie, Elira. Not to me, and not to you, if you allow yourself to feel it honestly." Elira shook her head, her thoughts spinning too fast to settle on anything solid. "Your Majesty, I think perhaps the wine." "I have had very little wine tonight," he interrupted softly, "and none of it has clouded my senses in the slightest. What I felt in that hall was real, and it has not faded in the hours since." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the dying kitchen fire. Elira stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some elaborate cruelty dressed up as kindness. But she found none. Only quiet, steady certainty, and something that looked almost like wonder. "I don't know what you want me to say," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to say anything tonight," Kellen replied. "I only needed you to know the truth of what I felt. I will not force this on you, Elira. But I will not pretend I felt nothing either." He held her gaze a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet kitchen, before he inclined his head respectfully and turned to leave, pausing only briefly at the door to look back at her one final time. "Sleep well," he said softly. "I hope tomorrow brings you a little more peace than tonight has." And then he was gone, leaving Elira alone once more among the dying embers of the kitchen fire, her heart pounding with a confusion she had no idea how to untangle. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling of the servants' quarters, replaying his words over and over until they lost all meaning and gained it back again in equal measure. A mate. The Alpha King of Frostmen believed she was his mate. It seemed impossible, the kind of thing that only happened in stories told to children before bed, not something that could ever apply to a scarred kitchen maid who had spent her entire life being told she was less than whole. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, but there was no time to rest. The castle was already stirring with activity, servants rushing to prepare for another day of treaty negotiations between the two packs. Elira dragged herself from bed and dressed quickly, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to wake herself properly before heading down to the kitchen. Nora took one look at her and frowned. "You look like you haven't slept at all." "I'm fine," Elira said, reaching for an apron. "Just a restless night." Nora did not look convinced, but she let the matter drop as the kitchen filled with the usual morning chaos of breakfast preparations. Elira threw herself into the work, chopping and stirring and carrying trays with mechanical focus, trying desperately not to think about firelight and dark eyes and words that had upended everything she thought she understood about herself. It did not work particularly well. By midday, whispers had begun circulating through the castle, carried on the lips of servants who had noticed something unusual in the way the Alpha King had inquired, quietly but persistently, about the whereabouts of a particular kitchen maid. Alpha Edmund, upon hearing these whispers, had grown visibly uneasy, though he said nothing directly to Elira about it. Beatrice, however, was not nearly so subtle. She found Elira in the pantry that afternoon, sorting through sacks of grain, and closed the door behind her with a soft click that immediately put Elira on edge. "I hear the king asked about you last night," Beatrice said, her voice deceptively pleasant, the kind of pleasant that always preceded something far less kind. "That must have been quite exciting for someone like you." "I don't know what you mean," Elira said carefully, keeping her eyes on the grain sacks. "Don't play games with me." Beatrice's tone sharpened slightly. "Everyone in this castle knows what you are, Elira. A charity case my father took in because it made us look generous. You have no scent worth reading, no family, no standing. Whatever strange notion the king has in his head right now, it will pass. Kings do not choose kitchen maids for anything more than a passing amusement." The word stung more than Elira wanted to admit, old insecurities rising to the surface with practiced ease. She had told herself the exact same things throughout the long, sleepless night, and hearing them spoken aloud by someone else did nothing to ease the doubt curling in her stomach. "I never claimed to be anything more than what I am," Elira said quietly. "Good." Beatrice's smile turned brittle. "Then remember that, and stay away from him. My father is depending on this alliance, and I intend to be the one standing beside King Kellen when the treaty is signed. Do not embarrass this pack any further than you already have." She left without waiting for a response, and Elira remained alone in the pantry for several long minutes, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of a grain sack, trying to steady herself against a fresh wave of humiliation. Perhaps Beatrice was right. Perhaps whatever Kellen believed he had felt the night before was nothing more than confusion, a trick of the senses brought on by wine and unfamiliar surroundings. It would certainly be easier to believe that than to hope for something she had long ago convinced herself she could never have. She threw herself into her work for the remainder of the day, determined to keep her thoughts occupied and her distance from anywhere the Alpha King might be found. It proved more difficult than she anticipated, given that treaty negotiations kept most of the pack's important figures confined to the main hall and adjoining chambers, well away from the kitchens where she remained hidden. By evening, she genuinely believed she had succeeded in avoiding him entirely, and something that felt disturbingly like disappointment settled uncomfortably in her chest at the thought. She was proven wrong shortly after the dinner hour. The kitchen had emptied for the night, most of the staff retreating to their quarters after a long day of preparation and cleanup, leaving Elira alone once more to finish the last of the evening chores. She had just finished banking the kitchen fire when the door opened quietly, and she turned to find Kellen standing there once again, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Your Majesty," she said, straightening quickly, memories of Beatrice's warning fresh in her mind. I did not expect you again tonight. I hoped I might find you here, Kellen said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him. I understand if my presence makes you uncomfortable. I only wish to check whether you had thought further about what I said last night. Elira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly acutely aware of her scars beneath her rolled sleeves. I have thought of little else, if I am honest. And what conclusions have you reached? She hesitated, uncertain how to voice the tangled mess of hope and doubt that had occupied her thoughts all day. I think it would be easier for both of us if you were simply mistaken, she finally admitted. Your alliance with this pack matters a great deal, and Beatrice has made it clear she expects to stand beside you when the treaty is signed. I am a kitchen maid with a broken scent and scars that most wolves cannot look at without disgust. Whatever you believe you felt last night cannot possibly be worth the complications it would bring. Something shifted in Kellen's expression at her words, a quiet intensity replacing the calm patience he had shown the night before. He crossed the kitchen slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, but she found herself frozen in place, unable to retreat even as he closed the distance between them. Do you believe your scars make you disgusting? He asked quietly. The directness of the question caught her off guard. I believe most people do, she said carefully, avoiding a direct answer. I did not ask what most people believe. His voice remained gentle, but there was still beneath it the quiet authority of a man accustomed to cutting through evasion. I asked what you believe. Elira's throat tightened, old wounds reopening with painful clarity. I believe the fire took something from me that I would never get back, she said, her voice barely steady. I believe that whatever made me worthy of being chosen by someone burned away along with everything else that night. My parents. My home. Any chance at a normal life. I have spent years telling myself it does not matter, that I do not need a maid born to have worth, but it is difficult to believe that when everyone around me treats me as though I am already less than whole. Kellen's expression softened into something achingly tender, and before she could react, he lowered himself slowly to his knees in front of her, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Your Majesty, she gasped, startled by the sudden movement. Please, you should not. Let me show you something, he said quietly, reaching for her hand with careful, deliberate slowness, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished. She did not. His fingers closed gently around her wrist, turning her arm slightly so the firelight caught the scars running along her forearm. He pressed his lips softly to the first scar, just above her wrist. Elira's breath caught in her throat, her entire body going still with shock. No one had ever touched her scars with anything other than pity or disgust. She had certainly never imagined a king kneeling before her, treating marks she had spent years hiding as though they were something worth honoring rather than something shameful to be concealed. This one, Kellen murmured, moving his lips to the next scar along her arm, tells me you survived something that should have destroyed you completely. He continued slowly, tracing a gentle path up her forearm, pausing at each scar to press a soft kiss against it, his voice low and steady as he spoke. This one tells me you carried grief no child should ever have to carry, and still you found a way to keep living. Another kiss, another scar. This one tells me the world tried to convince you that you were broken, and still some part of you refused to believe it completely, or you would not still be standing here in front of me. Tears gathered in Elira's eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had never allowed herself to cry in front of anyone, certainly not someone of Kellen's standing, but something about the tenderness of his words and the gentleness of his touch cracked open a part of her she had kept locked away for years. Please stop, she whispered, though she made no move to pull her arm away. I don't understand why you are doing this. Kellen looked up at her, still on his knees, his expression fierce with quiet conviction. Because every mark on your body tells a story of survival, Elira, not of brokenness. A scarred scent is not a ruined scent. It simply means the world made it harder for others to see what was always there. It made it harder for anyone but the one meant to find you. He pressed one final kiss to a scar near her elbow, then rose slowly to his feet, still holding her hand gently in his own. I am not mistaken about what I felt last night. I am not confused, and I am not simply amused by a passing curiosity. I felt a bond settle into place the moment I caught your scent, and I have felt it grow stronger every moment since. Elira stared up at him, tears still tracking silently down her face, torn between disbelief and a fragile hope she was terrified to acknowledge. What if you are wrong? She asked quietly. What if this bond fades once you return to Frostmain, and I am left having believed something that was never real? Maid bonds do not fade, Kellen said gently. They only grow stronger with time, if both parties allow it. I cannot force you to believe me, Elira, and I will not force this bond upon you if it is not something you want. But I needed you to understand the truth before I leave this castle, whatever choice you ultimately make. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft crackle of the kitchen fire and the sound of Elira's unsteady breathing. She searched his face for any hint of deception, any flicker of the cruelty she had come to expect from those in positions of power, but found nothing except quiet, steady sincerity. I am afraid, she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. I have spent so long believing that no one could ever want me, that accepting this feels more terrifying than continuing to be overlooked. I understand that fear, Kellen said softly. I will not ask you to abandon it overnight. But I will ask you to consider one thing. He squeezed her hand gently. What if the story you have been told about yourself was wrong from the very beginning? What if the fire did not ruin you, but simply marked you as someone strong enough to survive it, and worthy of a bond deep enough to see past every scar to whatever remains underneath? Elira had no answer for that. She stood in the quiet kitchen, her hand held gently in the grip of a king who had knelt before her and kissed every mark she had spent years trying to hide, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps she had been wrong about herself all along. I need time, she finally said. This is a great deal to accept all at once. Take whatever time you need, Kellen replied without hesitation. I am not going anywhere, Elira. Not until you have made your choice freely, without fear or pressure from anyone, including me. He released her hand slowly, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer, memorizing every detail as though committing it carefully to memory. Then, with a final gentle nod, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving her alone once more with her racing thoughts and the lingering warmth of his touch still tingling along her scarred skin. She sank slowly onto a wooden stool near the dying fire, pressing her fingers against her lips as though trying to hold in the overwhelming rush of emotion threatening to spill over. For years she had told herself that her scars made her unworthy of love, unworthy of belonging, unworthy of anything beyond the quiet, overlooked existence she had built for herself within the walls of Blackthorn Castle. Kellen's words had cracked something open inside her that she was not entirely certain could be closed again, even if she wanted it to be. She did not know, sitting there in the quiet kitchen with tears still drying on her cheeks, that Beatrice had been listening from just outside the door, her ear pressed against the wood, her expression twisting from disbelief into something far colder and more dangerous as she absorbed every word that had passed between the Alpha King and the scarred maid he claimed as his mate. Beatrice slipped away from the door before either of them could discover her presence, her mind already racing through every possible way she might use what she had just learned to her own advantage. She had spent years positioning herself as the natural choice for any powerful alpha seeking a mate, and she had no intention of watching that future slip away because of some kitchen maid with a sad story and a few old scars. Whatever it took, Beatrice intended to make certain that Elira Hatfield never stood beside the Alpha King as anything more than the servant she had always been. By the following morning, Beatrice had already gone to her father. Alpha Edmund sat in his private study, reviewing treaty documents with a furrowed brow, when his daughter entered without knocking and closed the door firmly behind her. "We have a problem," she announced without preamble. Edmund looked up, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. "What kind of problem?" "The kitchen maid. Elira." Beatrice crossed her arms. "The Alpha King believes she is his mate." Whatever Edmund had expected to hear, it clearly was not that. He set down his quill slowly, his expression shifting from irritation to alarm. "That is not possible. Her scent has been unreadable since the fire. The healers confirmed it years ago." "I heard him say it myself," Beatrice pressed. "Last night, in the kitchens." He knelt before her and kissed her scars. "Father." He called the bond real. "If word of this spreads, and King Kellen chooses her over any proper match, what would that mean for our alliance? What will it mean for this family?" Edmund's jaw tightened, his mind clearly racing through the political implications of what his daughter had just described. A king choosing a servant as his mate was not entirely unheard of in the history of the parks, but it was rare, and it rarely reflected well on the park that had treated that servant so poorly for years beforehand. If Calen truly believed Elira was his mate, and if word ever reached him about precisely how she had been treated within these walls, the consequences for Blackthorn's standing could be severe. "This cannot be allowed to continue," Edmund said finally. "I will speak with the king myself. Surely once the matter is explained properly, he will see reason." But reason, as it turned out, was not something easily imposed upon a bond as deep and immediate as the one Calen had recognized. Edmund requested an audience with the Alpha King later that morning, ostensibly to continue their treaty discussions, though his true purpose became clear within minutes of the conversation beginning. "Your Majesty," Edmund began carefully, "once the formalities had been dispensed with, I understand there may have been some confusion regarding one of our kitchen staff." Calen's expression remained carefully neutral, though something sharpened behind his eyes at the mention of Elira. "I am not aware of any confusion. I have simply recognized my mate among your household. With respect, Your Majesty, the girl's scent has been documented as damaged since a fire many years ago. Our own healers confirmed she carries no readable mate signature. Whatever you believe you detected may have simply been." "I know what I felt," Calen interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority that immediately silenced Edmund's attempt at deflection. "I have led my pack for years, Alpha Edmund. I have negotiated treaties, settled disputes, and led wolves into battle. I do not confuse wine and candlelight for a bond that settles into a man's very bones. Elira Hatfield is my mate, and I intend to treat her as such." Edmund's composure cracked slightly beneath the weight of the king's certainty. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, this places our alliance in a difficult position. My daughter Beatrice has hoped." "Your daughter's hopes are not my concern," Calen said flatly. "I came here to negotiate peace between our territories, not to select a bride based on political convenience. If this alliance depends on my willingness to ignore the reality of a true mate bond, then perhaps this alliance is not as sound as you believe it to be." The threat, though delivered calmly, landed with the weight of an axe. Edmund paled visibly, understanding at once that pushing further on this matter risked unraveling the very treaty he had spent months working to secure. "Of course not, Your Majesty," Edmund said quickly, backpedaling with the practiced smoothness of a politician sensing danger. "I only wished to ensure there was no misunderstanding that might complicate matters unnecessarily." "There is no misunderstanding," Calen replied. "Only clarity, which I would ask you to extend to your entire household, effective immediately. Elira Hatfield is not to be treated as a servant any longer, nor mocked for scars that mean nothing beside the truth of what lies beneath them. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me directly, and by extension, disrespects any alliance between our packs." Edmund swallowed hard, understanding the full weight of what had just been said. "I will make certain the household understands, Your Majesty." "See that you do." Word of the exchange spread through Blackthorn Castle faster than any fire, whispered from servant to servant, from guard to guard, until every corner of the household understood that the Alpha King had claimed the scarred kitchen maid as his mate, and that Alpha Edmund himself had backed down rather than risk the treaty. The reaction among the pack was immediate and varied. Some servants who had shown Elira quiet kindness over the years felt a swell of vindication on her behalf, glad to see her finally receiving the recognition she deserved. Others, particularly those who had participated most enthusiastically in mocking her over the years, reacted with a mixture of disbelief, jealousy, and hastily constructed apologies delivered with transparent insincerity. Nora found Elira in the kitchen later that day, practically vibrating with excitement. "Everyone is talking about it," she said, gripping Elira's hands tightly. "The king truly said it himself, in front of Alpha Edmund. You are his mate." Elira, still reeling from the events of the past 2 days, could hardly process the shift happening around her. Servants who had barely acknowledged her presence before now offered tentative smiles in the hallways. Others averted their eyes entirely, clearly ashamed of years spent participating in her mistreatment. Beatrice, however, was nowhere near as willing to accept defeat quietly. She cornered Elira again that evening, this time in the narrow corridor leading toward the servants' quarters, her expression cold and calculating. "Enjoy this while it lasts," Beatrice said, blocking Elira's path. Kings grow tired of novelty quickly. Once he tires of playing the noble savior, rescuing the postcard made from a miserable life, you will find yourself discarded and forgotten, and this pack will not take you back after the embarrassment you have caused. "I never asked for any of this," Elira said quietly, refusing to back down despite the tremor in her voice. "I never sought the king's attention, Beatrice. If you have grievances, perhaps you should direct them toward him rather than toward me." Something flickered across Beatrice's face, perhaps surprise at the quiet still in Elira's response, though she quickly masked it with renewed hostility. "You think you belong among wolves like him? You, with your ruined scent and your kitchen apron. You will never truly belong in his world, no matter what fantasy he has convinced himself to believe." "Perhaps not," Elira admitted, her voice steadier now than it had been in years. "But I would rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life believing I am worth nothing simply because the fire left marks on my skin." She stepped past Beatrice before the other woman could respond further, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, jaw clenched with frustrated anger. That evening, as the castle settled into a tense quiet following the day's revelations, Kellen requested a formal meeting with Alpha Edmund and the park's senior council, a meeting that quickly took on the weight of something far more significant than a simple diplomatic follow-up. He stood before the assembled council, his presence commanding despite his relatively young age, and addressed the room with the calm authority of a man who had spent years learning to command respect through fairness rather than fear. "I have spent 2 days within these walls," Kellen began, "and in that time, I have witnessed the way this pack treats one of its own. A woman who survived the fire that killed her family, who has spent years serving this household with quiet dedication, has been mocked, dismissed, and treated as though her worth were determined by scars she did not choose to carry." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council, some uncomfortable, others defensive. "I understand that packs have their own customs, their own hierarchies," Kellen continued. "But cruelty dressed up as tradition is still cruelty, and I will not enter into an alliance with a pack that treats vulnerability as an invitation for mockery rather than compassion." His gaze swept across the room, settling briefly on Beatrice before moving on. "Elira Hatfield is my mate. That fact will not change, regardless of anyone's discomfort with it. Going forward, I expect this household to treat her with the respect due to her position, both as a survivor of tremendous loss and as the future mate of an Alpha King." Alpha Edmund, standing beside his king with visible tension in his shoulders, cleared his throat. "The council understands, Your Majesty, and I assure you, appropriate corrections will be made." "See that they are," Kellen said. "I will be watching closely, and I assure you, I will know if my request has been ignored." The meeting concluded shortly after, leaving the council chamber buzzing with quiet, anxious conversation as members processed the implications of what had just occurred. An Alpha King had publicly staked his claim, publicly challenged the pack's treatment of one of its most overlooked members, and made unmistakably clear that any further disrespect toward Elira would carry consequences extending far beyond simple embarrassment. Elira, unaware of the meeting taking place within the council chamber, spent that evening in the kitchen as she always did, though the atmosphere around her had shifted noticeably. Servants who passed through offered small kindnesses, an extra portion of bread, a helping hand with a heavy pot, gestures that would have seemed insignificant days earlier but now carried the weight of quiet apology. She did not fully trust the change. Years of mistreatment had taught her that kindness could vanish as quickly as it appeared, and she remained wary of believing this shift represented anything more than temporary deference born of fear rather than genuine remorse. Kellen found her again that night, though this time he did not need to seek her out in secret. He simply walked into the kitchen openly, his presence no longer something to be hidden or explained away, and found her sitting quietly near the hearth, staring into the flames with an expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and cautious hope. "I heard about the council meeting," she said softly, not looking up as he approached. "Word travels quickly in this castle." Kellen settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, though he made no move to touch her without invitation. "I hope I did not overstep. I know this attention may feel overwhelming." "It does," she admitted. "For years I existed in the background of this park, and now suddenly everyone looks at me differently. I do not know how to trust it." You do not have to trust it all at once, Kellen said gently. Trust can be built slowly, the same way anything worthwhile is built. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove I am not simply passing through your life the way others have. Elira finally turned to look at him, studying his face in the firelight, searching for any hint of the deception she had spent years bracing herself against. She found none, only the same steady sincerity that had accompanied every word he had spoken to her since the moment their paths first crossed. I am still afraid, she admitted quietly. I know, Kellen said. But you do not have to face that fear alone anymore, if you choose not to. For the first time since the fire that had taken everything from her, Elira allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that perhaps the life she had resigned herself to was not the only life available to her after all. 3 weeks later, Elira stood at the edge of the Frostmain border, looking out over territory unlike anything she had ever seen within the walls of Blackthorn Castle. Tall pines stretched toward the pale sky, their branches dusted with the last remnants of a late snow, and beyond them rose the towers of a castle far grander than anything she had known before, its stone walls catching the morning light in shades of silver and gold. The treaty between Blackthorn and Frostmain had been signed without further complication, Alpha Edmund clearly eager to smooth over the tension caused by his household's treatment of the woman who would soon stand beside the king. Beatrice had said nothing further to Elira in the weeks leading up to her departure, though the cold fury in her eyes each time their paths crossed made her feelings on the matter abundantly clear. Nora had cried when Elira left, embracing her tightly at the castle gates and making her promise to send word once she settled into her new life. You deserve this, Nora had whispered fiercely. After everything, you deserve every bit of happiness coming your way. The journey to Frostmain had taken the better part of 2 weeks, traveling alongside Kellen and his guards through territories Elira had never before seen, forests and rivers and small villages that greeted their king with genuine warmth wherever they passed. She had watched him during those weeks, observing the way he interacted with his people, patient and fair even when matters grew complicated, and she found herself understanding more clearly with each passing day why his own pack held him in such high regard. Their conversations during the long days of travel had slowly chipped away at the walls she had spent years building around herself. Kellen asked about her childhood before the fire, about small memories of her parents that she had not spoken aloud in years, and listened with such genuine attention that she found herself sharing things she had never told another living soul. In turn, he shared pieces of his own life, the weight of becoming Alpha King so young, the loneliness of leadership, the years spent wondering if he would ever find the bond so many wolves took for granted. By the time they reached the borders of Frostmain territory, something had shifted quietly between them, a growing trust built not on the sudden intensity of a mate bond alone, but on the accumulated weight of countless small moments shared honestly between two people slowly learning each other. Now, standing at the edge of the territory that would soon become her home, Elira felt a flutter of nervous anticipation as Kellen drew his horse alongside hers. Nervous, he asked, noticing the tension in her shoulders. Terrified, she admitted with a small, wry smile. Your pack has heard the same stories about my scent that Blackthorn has. I do not know how they will receive me. They will receive you as their future queen, Kellen said firmly, because that is precisely what you are. Give them time, Elira. My people are fair, and they trust my judgment. Once they see what I see in you, any doubt will fade. His confidence did little to fully ease her nerves, but she appreciated the steadiness of it nonetheless, and together they continued the final stretch of the journey toward the Frostmain castle gates. The initial reception, as expected, carried an undercurrent of curiosity and cautious appraisal. Word had traveled ahead of their arrival, and the entire pack had gathered near the gates to witness their king returning with the mate he had claimed from a neighboring territory, a woman whose scarred scent had once been dismissed as broken by those who did not understand her. Elira felt the weight of countless eyes upon her as she dismounted, her scars visible beneath the sleeves of her traveling clothes, and for a moment old instinct screamed at her to hide, to shrink back into the shadows where she had spent so many years feeling safe from judgment. But Kellen reached for her hand, steady and sure, and led her forward rather than allowing her to retreat. My people, he called out, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, I present to you Elira Hartfield, my mate, and the future queen of this pack. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, though Elira noted with cautious relief that none of it carried the sharp cruelty she had grown accustomed to at Blackthorn. Instead, curiosity mingled with genuine respect for their king's evident conviction, and several of the older wolves near the front of the crowd inclined their heads respectfully in her direction. An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her eyes kind despite the sharpness of her assessment. This, Chenal explained quietly, was Margaret, the pack's most respected healer and one of his closest advisors. Margaret studied Elira for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the scars visible beneath her sleeves, before speaking. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward Elira's arm. Elira glanced at Chenal, who nodded encouragingly, and hesitantly extended her arm toward the healer. Margaret's fingers were gentle as she examined the scarred skin, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying. "Remarkable," she murmured after a moment. "The scar tissue runs deep, but I can sense the underlying sense structure clearly now that I know to look for it properly. Whoever told you this was broken beyond recognition either lacked the skill to read it correctly, or simply did not wish to try." Something in Elira's chest loosened slightly at the healer's words, a validation she had not realized she desperately needed until she received it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Margaret smiled, patting her arm gently before releasing it. "Welcome to Frostmain, my dear. I suspect you will find this pack considerably more welcoming than wherever you came from." The weeks that followed brought their own challenges, as Elira slowly adjusted to a life so different from the one she had known within the walls of Blackthorn Castle. Where she had once scrubbed floors and hauled firewood, she now found herself learning the responsibilities expected of a future queen, meeting with pack elders, understanding the political intricacies of Frostmain's territory, and slowly building relationships with people who had initially regarded her with understandable caution. Not everyone within Frostmain welcomed her immediately or without reservation. A handful of pack members, some who had hoped for a match closer to their own standing, whispered doubts about her suitability, questioning whether a former kitchen maid truly possessed the qualities necessary to stand beside their king. Elira heard these whispers, though she found herself handling them with a quiet resilience she had not known she possessed, drawing on years of enduring far crueler treatment at Blackthorn. Chenal noticed her struggles, even when she tried to hide them, and made a point of standing beside her publicly whenever doubt threatened to take root among his people. Slowly, gradually, genuine acceptance began to replace cautious curiosity, as the pack witnessed firsthand the quiet strength and dignity Elira carried despite years of mistreatment elsewhere. Victor, Chenal's trusted second, became one of her earliest and most vocal supporters within the pack, impressed by the calm patience she demonstrated even when faced with unwarranted skepticism. "Any woman who survived what you survived, and still carries herself with such grace," he told her one evening during a quiet dinner, "deserves far more respect than a title alone could ever provide." Garrett, similarly, found himself won over by her quiet kindness toward the pack's younger members, several of whom gravitated naturally toward her patient warmth, drawn by a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the rigid formality often expected of those in positions of power. Slowly, month by month, Frostmain began to feel less like foreign territory and more like something Elira had never quite dared to imagine for herself. A home. A place where her scars did not define the limits of her worth, but rather stood as evidence of survival worthy of respect rather than mockery. 6 months after her arrival, Frostmain held a formal ceremony to officially recognize Elira as Chenal's maid before the full assembly of the pack, a tradition reserved for moments of significant importance within their community. The great hall of Frostmain Castle, larger and grander than anything Blackthorn possessed, filled with wolves from every corner of the territory, gathered to witness the formal bonding ceremony between their king and the woman he had chosen. Elira stood before the assembled crowd in a gown the color of winter frost, her scars visible along her arms and neck, no longer hidden beneath long sleeves or careful positioning. She had made a deliberate choice in the weeks leading up to the ceremony to stop concealing what she had once believed marked her as unworthy, choosing instead to let her scars stand as visible proof of everything she had survived. Chenal stood before her, his expression solemn with the weight of the moment, though warmth radiated from every line of his face as he looked at her. 6 months ago, he began, addressing the assembled crowd, "I traveled to a neighboring territory to negotiate a treaty, and instead found the woman fate had always intended for me." Elira Hatfield survived a tragedy that would have broken many others completely, and instead of breaking, she carried herself through years of hardship with a quiet strength few could match. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own before the entire gathered pack. Some believed her scars made her scent unreadable, her worth diminished, her place among us uncertain. I say to you now, before this entire assembly, that every scar upon her body tells a story of survival rather than brokenness, and I consider myself endlessly fortunate that fate led me to recognize the truth of what lay beneath them. He knelt then, just as he had that first night in the Blackthorn kitchens, and pressed his lips gently to the scars along her wrist, then her forearm, working his way upward with the same tender reverence he had shown her from the very beginning, this time before the eyes of his entire pack rather than hidden away in secret. A hush fell over the great hall, broken only by soft murmurs of genuine emotion rippling through the crowd as they witnessed their king honor his mate so openly, so completely, without a trace of the shame or disgust that had once been directed toward her at Blackthorn. When Kellen finally rose to his feet, his eyes bright with quiet emotion, he turned to address his people one final time. "I present to you your future queen," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Not despite her scars, but marked by the survivor they represent. Elira Hatfield, soon to be Elira Voss, Queen of Frostmain. The hall erupted into applause, genuine and warm, wolves from every corner of the territory rising to their feet to honor the moment. Elira felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked out over the crowd, searching for any lingering trace of the mockery and disdain she had spent years enduring, and finding instead only respect, warmth, and quiet celebration. Margaret stood near the front of the crowd, her expression proud, while Victor and Garrett exchanged approving nods nearby. Even the pack members who had once harbored quiet doubts about her suitability now clapped with genuine enthusiasm, won over by months of witnessing her grace and resilience firsthand. Later that evening, after the formal ceremony had concluded and the celebration had wound down into quiet conversation among smaller groups scattered throughout the castle, Elira found herself standing alone with Kellen on a balcony overlooking the moonlit grounds of Frostmain, the same forest she had first glimpsed weeks earlier now feeling entirely like home. "Do you remember," Kellen asked quietly, "the first night in the kitchen at Blackthorn, when I told you your scent was not broken?" "I remember every moment of that night," Elira said softly. "I did not believe you at the time. And now?" She turned to face him fully, the moonlight catching the scars along her neck and arms, no longer something she felt compelled to hide or apologize for. "Now I believe that the fire may have marked my skin, but it never touched whatever it is that made me worthy of finding you. I spent years believing I was broken beyond repair. You showed me I was simply waiting to be seen properly." Kellen reached for her hand, lacing his fingers gently through hers as they looked out over the moonlit territory that would be theirs to protect and lead together for years to come. "The pack laughed at what they did not understand," he said quietly. "But understanding was never truly beyond their reach. They simply never bothered to look closely enough to find it." Elira leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the cool night air settled around them, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow and something warmer underneath, a promise of belonging she had once believed impossible for someone like her. She had spent years being told her scars made her less than whole, that the fire had taken something from her that could never be recovered. Standing there beside the man who had knelt before her and kissed every mark without hesitation or disgust, she finally understood the truth that had eluded her for so long. She had never been broken at all. She had simply been waiting for someone patient enough, and brave enough, to see what had always been there beneath the scars, and to love her not in spite of her survival, but because of it.